여러분 안녕하십니까? 저는 대사관에서는 항상 그 호주 기업에 대해서 그 한국 시장의 기획, 사업 계획에 관해서 좀 항상 설명드리고 있는 역할인데 오늘은 좀 반대로 그 호주 시장의 기회에 관해서 좀 설명드리고자 합니다. 아시다시피 동시 통역해 주시는 분들이 계시니까 오늘은 영어로 편하게 영어로 하겠습니다만 좀 용서해 주세요. So today it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to Kita. And thank you to Ms. Kim for your previous presentation. It was extremely informative. I'm going to take a more high-level approach and I guess explain some of the opportunities that are arising from the FTA from, I guess, an Australian market perspective and also an Australian investment perspective. I'll start by guess explaining the broader climate in Australia. And for those of you who are familiar with the Australian climate, it's no surprise that we are an incredibly fastly growing economy relative to other developed countries. We have a similar sized GDP to Korea, and most of our economy, which is actually based on services, is cutting edge in terms of our capabilities. This is relatively unknown in Korea. Many Korean friends and colleagues tend to see Australia as an economy that is a bit of a farm, a quarry that provides a lot of energy, resources, which of course we do, but at the same time we are an economy that has some of the most capable and sophisticated services firms in the world. These are our growth credentials. It's just a high-level snapshot of the, I guess, the relativity of the Australian economy. And as you can see, relative to many other developed economies, we have a very, very good set of numbers. We are confident this will continue. We are projecting healthy growth for the near term. We're confident that growth will continue. We've had 23 years of uninterrupted economic growth in Australia, which is quite an extraordinary record. This slide here illustrates that. I won't dwell on there. I always put this slide in our presentations to start off because, again, for Korean audiences, it just highlights I guess, the diversity and the size of the Australian business opportunity. We have the third largest pool of funds under management in the world, one of the largest in the Asian region. In fact, it is the largest in the Asian region. And of course, in addition to these funds, we have some of the most capable funds managers in the world. I always include this slide. It's a random slide in some respects, but it just, I guess, highlights the sophistication, diversification of the Australian economy and the market. So today, I'm going to quickly talk about the broader bilateral trade relationship. I'll talk about specific opportunities that are arising from the FTA, and then I'll talk about the investment opportunities in Australia. Then I want to touch on some of the challenges, because for many Australian exporters, when they come to Korea, obviously face some difficulties in some sectors. The reverse is true as well. And I believe that many of the same challenges that our firms face in the Korean market are very similar to the challenges that your firms face in the Australian market. And a lot of those challenges can be overcome through just a better understanding on both sides about how the processes work. So Korea is Australia's fourth largest trading partner in total and our third largest export market. Now, to put that in context, the Korean market is double the size of the US market for Australia. It's several times larger than the Indian market for Australia, and it's much larger than many of our traditional partners, such as the UK. Now, the numbers for 2014 and 15 are going to be quite possibly much lower in terms of export, because two products, iron ore and coal, account for 50% of our exports to Korea. And as you all know, the price for those two commodities has almost halved in the last 6 months. So the dollar value of our trade with Korea will probably decline this year, and certainly I expect it to probably go down a bit from last year. However, I don't expect the ranking to change. And the other point I'd like to make is that for Korea, Australia is depending on the data, it's about your 7th largest trading partner. There is, if I could speak frankly, there is sometimes a tendency in Korea to underplay the importance of the Australian trading relationship relative to other countries where you have established relationships, the US, China, Japan, etc. But we're very proud of our of our importance to the Korean market. We're proud of our strong, reliable relationship that we've built up with many decades with our Korean friends. And I always try to sort of slip that into any presentation that in fact for Korea, Australia is a major and a very, very important market and in fact investor and investment destination. I won't dwell on this slide, it's just giving you some context. You all know this, we export primarily commodities to Korea, we import finished product. That means for Korean exporters going to Australia, I would expect the bulk of the opportunity to be in finished products and in refined products. There is also a significant opportunity around the investment story, which I'll talk about later. But if I was, I guess, giving advice to a Korean firm thinking about the Australian market, I'd be looking for a Korean firm that has a global capability and in a manufactured sector, in a manufactured product with a good price and that can compete competitively in terms of quality with a similar product from either Japan or China, who are other major suppliers of finished product to Australia. Again, that's not, I don't think it's anything extraordinary, it's just common sense. But most of the opportunity, I think, for Korean exporters in the Australian market is going to be in finished and manufactured products. The free trade agreement is, we just had a very comprehensive presentation from Ms. Kim. I guess stepping back, I wanted to highlight the great significance of this agreement. It's the highest quality agreement in terms of tariff reductions on both sides that we've concluded with an Asian partner, North Asian partner. It's equivalent to the conditions, basically equivalent to the conditions that Korea gave the US and that Korea gave the EU. So we have basically levelled the playing field for Australian exporters in the Korean market. We've levelled the playing field for Korean exporters in the Australian market as well. It was signed in April last year. This photograph is from when our Prime Minister visited in April. It was signed at the Blue House and it entered into force in December. For Korean exports, it's very, very significant because 86% of the exports from Korea, the tariffs in Australia have been abolished. All tariffs on all Korean exports to Australia will be eliminated within the next 8 years. The immediate beneficiary of this agreement is, of course, a company like Hyundai Motors. Hyundai, I think, are now either the largest or second largest, I can't remember the exact number, exporter of cars to Australia. And the elimination of tariffs on Korean exported cars is going to have a very real significant impact on one of Korea's largest companies. But there are many more examples. You also have the opportunity now to supply into the Australian government procurement market. Of course, the Commonwealth of Australia, which means the federal government, is still the largest single economic entity in Australia. The federal budget every year is the single largest budget that any organisation, of course, has. The ability to supply into the Australian government procurement market without any barriers is a very significant one for Korean suppliers. On the other side, you'll have significantly lower input costs from cheaper resources, oil and natural gas. LNG, for example, I think there was a 3% tariff on imports before the FTA came into force. That's been abolished. You've got much lower tariffs on things like food imports and the like, and I'll get to that in a second. This means that your importers and your manufacturers of food, for example, and your refiners of commodities are going to be much more competitive when they import from Australia and when they're re-exporting to the rest of the world. And of course, the investment story, which I'll touch on a bit later, the agreement makes it much more simple for Korean investors to invest in Australia. That allows you to effectively spread your risk around a very busy global investment marketplace. So what does this mean for Korea? It means better food security. It means that your importers are now going to be much more incentivized to import Australian product relative to US or Canadian or European. That means because of the reliability of Australian exporters in food, it means that your importers and your manufacturers of food are going to have a much more reliable source of supply because they don't need to continually think about price fluctuations. I should add also the Australian dollar has come down very, very significantly relative to the yuan over the last 6 months. I think it's now it's come down about 20-25% from its peak. So not only is there a very big benefit from 2 tariff cuts in the last 3 months, you've got a very, very cheap or relatively cheap Australian dollar, which makes our products more affordable. So again, thinking about the benefits for Korean exporters to Australia, if it's finished product, including potentially food, your inputs are going to be much cheaper, which makes your product, when it's exported back to Australia, much more competitive. I wanted to make the point also that 171 tariff lines were exempted in this agreement because we didn't want this to be a political issue in Korea. Things like rice, for example, milk powder, these sensitive products in Korea are not in the FTA, which means that that there is no threat to Korean domestic industry from agricultural industry from this agreement. The case of Australian beef, we got certainly a reduction of tariffs, but we don't play in the same market as Hanwoo, for example. Hanwoo is a totally different market, and we don't see it as a competitive dynamic with Hanwoo. We compete primarily against US beef in the Korean market. So this all means that the political context in Korea has been smooth, and there's been no issues raised whatsoever. And we're very proud of that, and we think it's a very good foundation for a very solid partnership going forward. Okay, trade opportunities. I'll just do a couple of slides from the Australian perspective because, sorry, that's my job. I have to talk about that, and then I'll talk about some of the advantages for the Korean side. I won't read this laundry list, but as you can see, there are significant tariff reductions on some of the biggest products that we export to Korea. All of the products that are listed here are things that Korea, with the exception of pork, are things that Korea relies very, very heavily on from Australia. So there's Australian wheat in almost everything. You almost certainly would have all eaten some product with Australian wheat in it today. If you drink beer, you would have sampled something with Australian malting barley. We supply most of the sugar, the raw sugar, to Korea. And so you can see how these reductions or eliminations are going to have a significant impact on the amount of product coming in from Australia. Dairy is a major beneficiary as well. Again, I won't go through all of these. You can read that, and you'll have access to the presentation later. But again, I'd be thinking about how you might want to take advantage of these if you're in the food processing industry looking to re-export to Australia. Wine is a personal favourite. 15% tariff, it's gone. We currently have about 4% of the Korean wine market, which is very low. Australia is a wine superpower, both in terms of the volumes that we produce, the volumes that we export, but the quality of the Australian wine. And we're spending, at the embassy, we're spending a large amount of time trying to promote the benefits of this particular tariff cut because we feel the Australian wine industry has got a lot of growth potential here in Korea because our product is so good. Horticulture, seafood, and things like seasonal elimination for potatoes. So again, for those of you who are in the food processing import industry and have business aspirations with Australia to re-export product, all of these reductions are very important and good news for you. On resources, again, I won't read through the laundry list. You've got it in the documents, so just you can refer to that as you wish. I should add the actual document is online. You can go to the DFAT website, dfat.gov.au. Just go to Korea and then pull up the agreement online. Don't print it off; you'll break your printer. It's about that thick. But I'd certainly encourage you to look at particular HS codes which pertain to your specific product. Okay, so this is very new for me to be presenting on Australian market opportunities, I might add. But these are some of the things that Korea makes competitively, and these are some of the markets in Australia for those products. The Aussie dollar is about 80, 70, 78 cents to the US dollar at the moment, to put that in context. So as you can see, these are big markets in Australia. much of the manufactured product that we import across all of these categories is made in China, and historically a large number of those also made in Japan. So as I said, common sense would suggest that if you're an exporter of any of these products and you want to crack into the Australian market, you need to have a product which is competitively priced against your Chinese competitor and which competes favourably on quality. The Australian market is pretty sophisticated. It's not as price sensitive, I think, depending on the sector, of course. I don't think it's a particularly price sensitive market in a lot of sectors. I think people look for quality primarily, whether that's food or whether that's a machine part or whatever. And so if you're going to be competing in the Australian market, quality is very important. I put services sector in here because the benefits are going to run both ways. We have an opened Korean service market here, legal services, for example, but also financial services under CAFTA. And we're hoping over time that's going to bring more Australian companies up to the Korean market, where they can work closely with their Korean counterparts who are looking also to crack into the Australian services market. And of course, services is not like exporting coal or a commodity. You need to have a good cultural, legal, and historical understanding of the market you're moving into. And so we think that over time, as more Australian services firms come up to Korea, work closely with their Korean counterparts, that the Korean service industry will get a better feel for the sort of market that the Australian opportunity presents, and that will have a positive impact on your prospects as services companies in the Australian market. So just to highlight another industry, the audiovisual co-production annex, which is diplomatic speak for an agreement on film production. That's also part of the FTA. It's a separate treaty inside, or separate agreement inside the FTA. That's a very obvious place where we can start working together, because it allows Australian firms in Korea to access domestic benefits and support for the domestic film industry in Korea and vice versa. So any of you involved in film, you can start thinking seriously about how you can take advantage of the FTA in Australia to make co-productions, or here in Korea with Australian firms. Investment opportunities. So Australia is a country which historically has been a capital importing country, where we've never had enough savings of our own, and we're heavily reliant on foreign capital, and we're almost entirely open economy when it comes to foreign investment. We welcome investment, we need it. The investment story from Korea is mixed. Korea, despite being our third largest export market, is lagging significantly behind other key trading partners for Australia on the investment story. And there's a lot of reasons for that, as we all know. But if you look here, Korea's number 18 on the list, and even well behind small city-states like Singapore, with a population of under 10% of South Korea. So we think there's enormous room for growth for the investment story. If you look at the numbers over the last few years, it's picking up very quickly, still growing off a low base. And even though probably 2014 that might plateau somewhat, we're very optimistic that the long-term trend can only go one way. Korea needs safe, stable overseas destinations for its investment to get the returns it needs to fund an ageing population. And Australia offers what Korea needs in terms of getting those returns in a very crowded space, and getting those returns relatively risk-free relative to other countries. These are the 5 sectors that we think for Korean investors offer the greatest amount of opportunity. Major infrastructure, that's things like ports and railways, airports. Tourism infrastructure, that's things like hotels. Resources and energy, coal mines, for example. Agriculture and food, that's things like obviously farms, but all the associated infrastructure with the agriculture value chain. So stuff like wheat silos or port loading facilities. And advanced technologies. I'd just like to quickly go through each of these because I believe this is where the real opportunity is for Korea with respect to the Australian market after CAFTA. And I should step back and say what has changed with investment and CAFTA. two things. One is the threshold for federal government approval being required for any inwards Korean investment has been raised to just over $1 billion. Previously, it was about $248 million. That means that under the previous pre-CAFTA regime, any Korean investment that was above $248 million had to go to federal government approval. And there's a special part of the Treasury Department, which sits inside the government in Canberra, that approves all investments over that. That threshold has been raised to over $1 billion, which is the same treatment that US investors get in Australia. So that means most investments now from Korea are going to not require federal government approval, which means it makes your life easier, and it's just another less bureaucratic step you have to go through when you're looking at investing in Australia. Okay, so back to major economic infrastructure. The infrastructure pipeline in Australia is nearly valued at $1 trillion. It's of all the advanced economies in the world, we think it's probably the largest, or one of the very largest pipelines of infrastructure projects which is online at the moment. Why is this the case? Well, we have a small population, but it's growing quickly. 24 million people concentrated in 5 cities. So our population density overall is low, but actually our population density in the cities is not low, because everyone lives in 5 cities basically. That is causing a lot of demand for new railway, new roads, new ports, new airports. And because we have a very generous immigration policy, our population growth rate is one of the highest in the advanced world. I can't remember the exact number, but it's 2 to 3% growth a year of population. Most of those people are coming into one of those 5 cities that I mentioned. And so the government is actively trying to build more infrastructure to cope with that influx. And we want Korea to be a part of that story. The asset recycling initiative, I'll just talk quickly about that. The states in Australia, because Australia is a federal system, the states in Australia are subject to various elections which are ongoing at any one time, moving towards selling or privatising existing assets and using that money to reinvest in new assets, and that's what we're calling the Asset Recycling Initiative. And again, a great opportunity for Korean companies, Korean investors, both private and government, to get involved in, because these assets are going to be sending out good returns over the next sort of 10, 20 years. Tourism infrastructure. So it's our largest services export. The number of visitors from Asia is forecast to increase by 7% in the next 5 years. Most of that growth is coming from China. And so we see, like, if I was a Korean hotel operator, owner, and I wanted to invest in the Chinese tourism market, I'd be looking at Australia, because most of the increase in foreign arrivals, tourist arrivals, is going to be coming from mainland China in Australia over the next few years. We don't have enough hotels to cater for that. We've got very, very strong hotel occupancy rates, and we basically need more tourist infrastructure. That means hotels. Korea's got the best EPC construction players in the world. You've also got great experience in building hotels to cater for and running hotels for the Chinese tourist market. Personally, I think this is a fantastic opportunity for a lot of Korean investors in particular, because you know the Asian market very, very well, and you know how to build great hotels. Resources and energy, again, even though the prices now are low relative to what they were a year ago, Korea is still going to need energy because you don't have any indigenous energy supplies. And now we think now is actually a fantastic time to actually invest in Australia, whilst the cycle is where it is. The prices are going to be probably much more reasonable than what they were a year or 2 years ago, and the long-term forecast for energy demand in Korea and the rest of the world is only going to go one way. So if it was me, I'd be looking seriously at which resources and energy investments I could expand on in Australia at this point in time, because of where the cycle is. Because sure as anything, this is going to bounce back. And our proximity to Asia, our first-rate capability in extracting resource and energy, and exporting that safely to Asia, reliably to Asia, puts us, I think, in a unique position for an investor when you're scanning global opportunities in resources and energy. And if you are interested, come and talk to us at Australia. We can certainly try and give you a list of potential projects. I've talked about agriculture and food in the trade context, but again, in the investment context, now is a fantastic time to look at the Australian agri-business investment opportunities. Not only does Korea need to, I guess, guarantee supply of key food commodities over coming years, the rest of Asia does as well. I think there's a very good re-export opportunity from Australia to countries like China, for example, in a whole range of agribusiness commodities. I'll give you one example. Chinese demand, mainland Chinese demand for Australian beef increased about 400% last year. 400%. You know, we make the best beef in the world. It's BSF free. It's clean and green. The demand for Australian beef in Asia, and that's one example of hundreds, is only going to increase. What a great investment if you're looking to tap into that exponential demand for high quality, clean and green product coming from Australia. So again, I'd think about agribusiness investment in Australia from a Korean perspective as not just offtake for the Korean market. It's about re-exporting to the rest of Asia as well. And because Korean companies are so good at manufacturing process and manufactured processed food product, I just think it's a match made in heaven potentially. And advanced technologies, we've got a wonderful track record in IP development and also in commercialization of product. Our healthcare industry is world-class. Our biotech industry is world-class. It's about the same scale as the Korean biotech industry, for example. And we have very, very good capability as well in digital economy. Again, Korea, I think, has very, very good commercialization capabilities on certain patents. We've got great research capabilities. Again, I think there's very good investment opportunity here for a Korean company which has good manufacturing and commercialization ability to work with an Australian research institute, for example. And again, we here at Australia, we can give you a list of opportunities in this respect if you're interested. I'll talk briefly about ISDS, which got a lot of attention during the negotiation. But basically, this provides more certainty to Korean investors in Australia because you have the ability to, if you ever needed to look at going to dispute resolution in a third market. Now, that also applies for Australian investors here in Korea. We, of course, in Australia are very proud of our judicial system. It's a fair, transparent, and open judicial system. There are no favours for Australian firms vis-a-vis foreign firms. It's very equitably applied. The law is very equitably applied to everybody. So it's unlikely that this will be invoked. But if it does, being built into the agreement, it does provide some additional certainty on both sides. Okay, challenges. When I pulled these slides together, I used the slides I use for Australian companies when entering the Korean market because I think the challenges are similar. And I don't think this is particularly difficult stuff. I think it's just common sense. But if you're looking to export to Australia, do your homework about the market size, the market structure, who your competitors are, who's growing, who's not. What are the price points? Who are the local players, etc., etc. Just do your homework. It would be the first point, I guess. Non-compliance with government requirements. There's some website material here, but we have quite strict requirements on a range of sectors, particularly for food, but also for raw products coming into Australia, as does Korea. So we often have Australian exporters of food or raw product coming to Australia. They run into Korea. They run into issues because they haven't complied fully with the Korean government regulations. Exactly the same applies when you're going to Australia. So if you're looking to export there for the first time, again, do your homework, just understand the regulatory framework as it applies to your particular product or service. We find often between Korean importers and Australian exporters, there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of the expectation for timescales. The culture here, as you know, is pretty fast. In Australia, it is fast as well, but sometimes it's not quite as fast as Korea. And so we often see a bit of friction there. The classic case of the Korean importer saying, I love your product, can you get it here tomorrow? And the Australian side might say, look, no, we have to spend a few weeks to get it ready, etc. And then the deal falls through. So just be aware when you're going to Australia, depending obviously where you are in Australia and depending on the sector, that you may have different timescales when you're dealing with the Australian importer, I guess, from your perspective. We often see a lot of documentation mistakes, so the presentation from Ms. Kim was very welcome because that sort of stuff applying back to the Australian side is also very important. Very, very different health and safety culture on a range of products and services. And again, just emphasise the need to fully understand the regulatory framework for whatever product or service you're looking to export to Australia. I don't think this is anything too complicated, but I do think a lot of companies miss the basic research before they go into a new market. So again, what do you need to get right? It's just the flip side of what I just described. Get the export documents correct, do your homework, get a good agreement on payment methods, make sure you have a good partner in Australia. The same applies for Australian companies into here, and be patient. I don't subscribe to the view that Korea is fundamentally different to Australia in terms of the business culture. At the end of the day, you're all in the same thing. And in Australia, you have to be patient. You have to build relationships, just like you do when you come into Korea. So I don't believe that there's a fundamental difference in the business culture. I think there are some things around the edges which are different, but fundamentally it's the same in terms of the need to build good relationships. So that's my presentation for today. I'll end with a quick plug for my organisation here in Korea. We're the equivalent of KOTRA. So we provide investment facilitation services. We support Australian companies coming into Korea. We promote Australian education in Korea. And we have an office of about 20 people. We're located inside the Australian Embassy, and we're here to help. So please do give me a call anytime if you think we can assist. But 오늘은 좀 끝까지 좀 말씀 들어주셔서 감사드립니다.